Chapter 19, Part 2, Seizing an American Empire, 1865 to 1913. In this section, we're going to specifically talk about the three presidents that are involved in imperialism, Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and William Howard Taft. Teddy Roosevelt became president in 1901 by the unfortunate assassination of William McKinley. After the Spanish-American War, when McKinley ran for re-election in 1900, Teddy Roosevelt was placed on the ticket as his vice president. No one expecting that McKinley would be unfortunately assassinated and Roosevelt would end up taking over the presidency. When Roosevelt took over the presidency, he is going to greatly change America's presidential leadership style. We'll talk about that more in Chapter 20 when we talk about the progressive presidents. But as an ardent imperialist, he also is going to take a very forceful role in foreign policy. And he is actually probably one of the presidents that we most identify with imperialism, and actually really kind of unjustly, because Woodrow Wilson did just as much. He just wasn't quite as vocal about it. Roosevelt's foreign policy is often referred to as the big stick diplomacy. Speak softly and carry a big stick. Because Roosevelt did believe that the United States should try to negotiate with other countries when possible, but if those negotiations failed, then you could use force if necessary to get what you wanted. And because he was always determined to really get what he wanted. And one of the first things that we see that he wanted was he wanted to build a canal in Central America. The U.S. had actually been debating and thinking about building a canal in Central America as far back as the 1850s, and we actually had an agreement with Great Britain that we would jointly build a canal in Central America. But that never came to fruition because of many different things. And shortly before the Spanish-American War, the British had given up their claims to building a canal in Central America, and so that left the United States on its own to build a canal. After the Spanish-American War, because we now have colonies in both the Caribbean and in the Pacific, building a canal became more important for the United States because in order to move the Navy or military personnel, we would have to go all the way around South America, all the way around Argentina, and that would take a very long time. So building a canal in the middle there would greatly shorten that distance for us and speed up military forces if we needed to move them from place to place. When we first started looking at building a canal in Central America, there were actually two possible locations. Panama, which is a very small, thin nation that belonged to Colombia at the time in Central America, and then Nicaragua. After much debate, a lot of lobbying, Congress passed the Spooner Act, which actually stated that the United States would opt for the Panamanian route to build the canal. Now, this means that we can begin negotiating with Colombia for the rights to build a canal there, because Panama did still belong to Colombia. After quite some time of negotiating, we did actually come up with a treaty called the Hay-Huron Treaty with Colombia to build a canal in across Panama. The Colombian Congress, though, when the treaty was sent to them, they did not ratify the treaty. They did not think that they were getting enough money. They felt that they weren't getting enough rights over the treaty, and so they refused to ratify the treaty. So President Roosevelt was a little upset about that. Now, we do still have the possibility of building the canal in Nicaragua, but Roosevelt was determined that the Panamanian route was the best route, and that's the one he wanted. So there was some discussion among his advisors, and actually even from some newspaper reporters, that, well, if Colombia would not give us the rights to build the canal in Panama, maybe we should appeal just directly to the Panamanian people and help them gain their independence from Colombia. Now, prior to this, there had been a weak Panamanian nationalist attempt to gain their independence. They were not very well organized. They were not very well funded. But Roosevelt thought that with American money and support, that this Panamanian nationalist group could possibly gain their independence. And so we began to reach out to them and throw our support toward them. And so in October of 1903, the Panamanians rose up against Colombia, and with American financial support, we did not send any troops, but we did send them weapons and we did send them money. The Panamanians were able to overthrow Colombia and gain their independence. The U.S. Was the first country to recognize Panama's independence, and in November of 1903, we negotiated the Hay-Buenaventura Treaty with them, which gave the United States the right to build a canal in Panama. Under the terms of the Hay-Buenaventura Treaty, the U.S. would gain control of a 10-mile wide strip of land to build the Panama Canal. This would give us enough land to build a canal and then have land on either side of the canal for administration and, to build shipping companies and those types of things. In exchange for this, the United States would pay Panama $10 million up front and then an additional $250,000 a year. And we felt that this was a good deal. It was a similar deal that we had offered to Colombia that they had turned down. The Panamanians will take up this deal, and so the Panama Canal will go under construction. It actually takes about 10 years to build the Panama Canal. There's a couple of pictures here on your slide of the canal finally opening in 1913. In that upper picture, you can see pictures of the ships going down the canal, and then the lower picture is a picture of William Gorgas, who was one of the engineers that helped to work on the canal. Like I said, it did take about 10 years for the canal to open. 1913, when the canal finally opened, Woodrow Wilson is president, and that kind of like renewed bad feeling between the U.S. and Colombia, because it reminded Colombia not only that they had lost the money that would be coming in from the canal, but they had also lost a province of Panama. The Wilson administration made some overtures to Colombia, and Wilson tried to get the U.S. Congress to pass an act that would have the U.S. apologize to Colombia for our actions in the Panamanian Revolution, and also pay Colombia a sum of money for their loss of Panama. Congress did not pass this act. They said it would be an insult to Teddy Roosevelt. A few years later, though, in 1921, after Roosevelt had died, Congress did allocate money to give to Colombia to compensate them for the loss of Panama. But we never did apologize for our actions in Panama. Another area in South America that is going to cause Roosevelt some interest and some concern is Venezuela. Venezuela was under the control of a dictator, Aprenio Castro. And through the years, Castro and his government had borrowed large sums of money from European countries, mostly Great Britain and Germany. And in 1902, Castro looked at how much money they owed, and he basically said, look, there's just no way we can pay this back. We're not even going to try. And so he informed Britain and Germany that they were going to just not pay their debt. Germany and Great Britain responded by sending a fleet of ships to Venezuela to blockade the Venezuelan coastline. President Roosevelt saw Britain and Germany's actions as a violation of the Monroe Doctrine, and so he sent these countries notification that they had 10 days to remove their ships from Venezuelan waters, or the U.S. would intervene to protect Venezuela. Now, Great Britain and Germany were not afraid of the United States, but they also did not want to enter a war over such trivial amounts of money that Venezuela owed them. And so both of those countries then removed their fleets from Venezuela. That kind of opened up the floodgates then. In 1903, the Dominican Republic, which is in the Caribbean, did the same thing. Their dictator said, hey, we owe a lot of money. We're not going to pay it back. America will protect us. So when the Dominican Republic did this in 1903, Roosevelt said, well, there's a little bit of a problem here. If we keep doing this, we're intervening to protect people who are trying to do the wrong things. And eventually, the European countries are going to take us up on our bluff, and they're going to go to war with us. So Roosevelt is going to offer the Dominican Republic a little bit of a different deal. In exchange for American protection, Roosevelt says, okay, we will protect you, but you're going to have to agree to America intervening in the Dominican Republic. And that intervention was that the U.S. Would send a custom agent to collect the customs duties for the Dominican Republic. Now, for a small island nation like the Dominican Republic, their customs duties are their primary revenue. And so this American agent is going to collect these customs duties. We will turn over 45% of everything we collect to the Dominican government. They will use that money to pay off their bills, to run their country, to do whatever. We will take the other 55% and we will pay their creditors. So it's basically really like a bankruptcy receivership, where we're going to make sure their bills are paid to their creditors, but we're going to give them some money to live on. Under American leadership, we doubled the amount of money that was being collected by the Dominican Republic, and we also began to pay off their bills. And so the Dominican Republic was in a much better shape because of American intervention than they had been before, and their bills were being paid. This lasted until 1916. In 1916, during Woodrow Wilson's presidency, the Dominican Republic informed the U.S. that they were ending their relationship with the U.S. regarding the customs duties. They felt this would be accepted by Wilson because Wilson had pledged when he was running for the presidency that he would not intervene in other countries. But Wilson is going to surprise them. Instead of saying, okay, that's fine, we'll let you be on your own, he sent the Marines into the Dominican Republic. And from 1916 to 1924, the Dominican Republic was actually under American military control. Of course, part of the reason that Wilson sent troops in 1916 was because this is during the middle of World War I. And by this time, we know that we may become involved, and we're concerned about the security of that region. Going back to Roosevelt and the Dominican Republic, though, after the Dominican Republic declared that they were not going to pay their debts, and we established this relationship where we would be collecting their customs duties for them, Woodrow Wilson issued what's known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. The Roosevelt Corollary basically stated that the U.S. can intervene in countries' affairs in the Western Hemisphere in order to prevent European intervention in the Western Hemisphere. So we took the Monroe Doctrine, which we basically told Europe to stay out of the Western Hemisphere, and then Roosevelt added on to that in order to protect that Western Hemisphere, we can intervene in the affairs of countries in the Western Hemisphere to prevent that European intervention. And under the auspices of the Roosevelt Corollary, the United States will intervene in Latin America many times during the early to mid 20th century. This map just gives us a view of the American interest in the Caribbean. It shows you the dark green areas are actual American possessions, meaning that direct imperialism. The light green areas are areas of occupation or protectorate, which are more of what we would call indirect imperialism. This is just a famous political cartoon of Roosevelt with his big stick using the American Navy to patrol the Caribbean and keep the Caribbean in control. And you see one of the ships there in the front says debt collection. And so you can see the various ways that we use our power, economic and military power, to control Central and South America and the Caribbean. Roosevelt was also very concerned with matters in Asia. And one of the countries that he felt that was very important for us to become involved with and relate to was Japan. Roosevelt saw Japan as the major player and the dominant power in the Pacific. And most people at the time didn't. They were like, oh, this is just a little island nation. What can they do? But Roosevelt said, no, this is really the power that, is the up-and-coming power. We need to have good relations with them. So one of the first things Roosevelt did after becoming president was he offered to mediate an end to a war between Russia and Japan. This Russo-Japanese war had been going on for a couple of years, and to many people's surprise, Japan was actually defeating Russia in this war, and Roosevelt was concerned about that because he was afraid that if Japan did defeat Russia and pushed Russia out of Manchuria in China and some of the other areas, that it would upset the balance of power in the Pacific and open up for Japan to take control of too much area there. Kind of a thought of what's going to happen down the road. So he will negotiate the Treaty of Portsmouth, which will end the Russo-Japanese War, and that really kind of opened up his relationship with Japan. And from that point forward, we begin to see that there is this relationship between the U.S. and Japan that had never been there before. And unfortunately, Roosevelt's successors will not follow through with this. But Roosevelt really did have the forethought to realize that Japan was the big player in the Pacific. The next thing that Roosevelt will do with Japan in 1907 is negotiate what is known as the Gentleman's Agreement. This came about because of California. California was concerned about Asian immigration to California. They had always been concerned about the Chinese immigration, and now there are many Japanese immigrating also. And so California had passed a state law that segregated their schools, keeping Asian students, including Japanese students, from going to school with the white students. And this had caused some difficult tensions between the U.S. and Japan. The Japanese government was greatly insulted about this, as I think most governments would be. And so Roosevelt convinced the state lawmakers in California to repeal that law. And in exchange, he made an agreement with Japan that for a period of 1 year, the Japanese would not issue any passports to Japanese moving to the United States. And so we kind of made this reciprocal agreement. The Japanese will stop their immigration for a year. We will get rid of that segregation law in California. Roosevelt, though, also recognized that one of the things that the Japanese respected was power, and that you had to negotiate with the Japanese from a position of power. If they felt that you were weak, they really would not negotiate with you and respect you. So after the Gentleman's Agreement, he was concerned that the Japanese might feel that we were kind of caving into them. And so he had been building up the U.S. Navy, and a lot of appropriations had been going to building up the U.S. Navy through his presidency. And so he decided that the U.S. Navy would go on this world tour, and they called it the Cruise of the Great White Fleet. Now, I want to pause here and say it is called the Great White Fleet, not because we are predominantly white Americans, but because at this time they painted all of the ships white. You know, today we look at these ships and they're that gray color. This time they were painted white, you can see in the picture, and so that's why it was called the Great White Fleet. It was not racial, it was just the color of the ships. And he made sure that the Great White Fleet stopped by Tokyo, the capital of Japan, on its tour as really kind of a show of power to show them, hey, we're not afraid of you, we have this massive modern navy. The interesting thing is, to show you cultural differences between people, is that the Japanese did not take this as an insult. They actually felt honored that our ships had stopped by their capital, and it led to a relationship of opening and a better relationship between the U.S. After the cruise of the Great White Fleet. Shortly before Roosevelt will leave office in 1908, he will also make the Root-Takahira Agreement with Japan. The Root-Takahira Agreement is an executive agreement. That means that it's not a Senate ratified treaty. It doesn't go through the Senate. So technically, an executive agreement is only enforceable by that president. So when the new president comes in, the new president does not have to go by it. Traditionally, though, in United States political history, all of our presidents respect the executive agreements that their predecessors have made. Under the terms of the Root-Takahira Agreement, Roosevelt is trying to clarify some things with Japan about China. And so he will get China to agree to maintain the status quo in the Pacific. Roosevelt was very much concerned about this balance of power in the Pacific, and he was very much concerned that Japan was going to start taking over smaller islands and portions of China, and so he got Japan to agree to maintain the status quo in the Pacific, not to take over any more territory. Also, under the terms of this treaty, he got the Japanese to agree to uphold the territorial integrity of China, to promise that they would not try to take over portions of China. He did not include in this discussion, which gave tacit approval for Japan to take over Manchuria, which was one of the larger provinces of China that Japan had always been interested in. But the Root-Takahira Agreement was an early effort on the part of the United States to curtail Japanese power in the Pacific. Unfortunately, down the road it did not work, but Roosevelt did see the potential issues that could come with Japanese aggression in the Pacific. In 1908, Roosevelt decided not to run for re-election. He could have. At this time, there was no term limits for the presidency, but he had been serving for 7 years because he had served most of McKinley's last term, becoming president in September of 1901. And he was a young man. He wanted to spend time with his family and go hunting and do the things that he wanted to do, so he decided to step aside. But William Howard Taft had been in his cabinet and was a friend of the president, so he supported Taft for the presidency. And so Taft, when he becomes president, will initiate a new foreign policy, but it's not really new, but it sounds new. It's called dollar diplomacy. And Taft basically defined it really better than anybody else. He said, dollar diplomacy is substituting dollars for bullets. Basically, the idea was that instead of using military force or physical force to convince countries to do what we wanted them to do, we would use our economic force. We would use our monetary forces to control them that way rather than expending military resources. One of the prime examples of dollar diplomacy in American history is Nicaragua. Shortly before Taft became president, Nicaragua had gone through a revolution, and they had overthrown their long-term dictator, and they were establishing or trying to establish a democratic government for Nicaragua. When the new leaders came into power in Nicaragua after the dictator fled the country, they realized that the dictator had stolen all the money. The country was pretty much bankrupt. So they asked the United States for a loan to give them money to run the country. And Taft agreed. So this is the beginning, really, of dollar diplomacy. We're going to make investment in the country. We're going to loan them money. But that's going to give us a lot of economic influence in the country. However, Taft mixes his dollar diplomacy a little bit with the big stick, because he also will send the Marines in to Nicaragua to, quote, protect our investment. He said, well, you're really not good for the money. Your last leader fled the country stealing all your money, so we're going to loan you the money, but we're going to send the Marines in to protect our investment, to make sure that it is used wisely in your country. During the time that the United States is in Nicaragua, which lasts really about 25 to 30 years, because the first troops go into Nicaragua in about 1910, and we leave briefly in around 1925, and then we come back into the country until 1934. So we're in there pretty much for a period of 20 to 25 years. But during the time that we're there, one of our jobs was to oversee the elections in the country, to make sure that they had honest elections. This is where some of the criticism of the U.S. involvement in Nicaragua started. The Nicaraguans said that only the pro-American leaders ever were elected during the time that we were overseeing the elections, and so we were unpopular in some camps because of that. We also set up and trained the Guardia Nacional for Nicaragua. Basically, the Guardia Nacional was a combined police force and military force, where today in the United States we have completely separate civilian and military forces. The police and the FBI and groups like that are civilians, and they are under one authority, and the military is a completely separate entity that cannot be used within the borders of the United States. The Guardia Nacional is the only armed force for Nicaragua, and it combines both policing duties with military duties. And basically what ends up happening, especially after the U.S. leaves, is whoever controls the Guardia Nacional is going to control Nicaragua. During the time that the United States is involved in Nicaragua, during the Woodrow Wilson administration, the U.S. will negotiate a treaty with Nicaragua known as the Bryan-Chamorro Treaty. The Bryan-Chamorro Treaty was ratified in 1916, and it gave the United States the right to build a canal in Nicaragua in perpetuity, which basically means forever. This was just in case the canal in Panama didn't work out, if it wasn't profitable, if it caved in or whatever. This will give us the right to build a canal in Panama in perpetuity. In exchange for this, we will pay Panama $3 million, and we will also, Panama will give the United States a 99-year lease to the Corn Islands, which were small little islands off the coast of Nicaragua. During the height of the Cold War, the Corn Islands were secret CIA bases for the United States for activities in Central and South America. Of course, that's not the case today because I know about it, so they're no longer secret CIA bases. But we did gain this right, and so that is another way of having what we would call indirect imperialism over Nicaragua this dollar diplomacy there. In 1928, the U.S. will oversee the elections of 1928, and we promised that if they were no problems in the elections and everybody agreed to the terms of the elections and everything, that we would leave. So in 1928, Anastasio Somoza, and who was a strong supporter of the United States, will be running for the presidency of Nicaragua against Sandino. And Somoza ended up winning the election, and the U.S. began making preparations that we would leave. But then Sandino and his people refused to recognize that Somoza had won the election. They cried foul, that the U.S. had intervened, that we had rigged the election, and he and his people took to the heels and began fighting a little civil war against the Somoza government. And so the U.S. had to come back into to Nicaragua to try to establish some type of peace and relationship there. Somoza actually ended up winning this civil war against Sandino. There's actually some interesting stories about this Nicaraguan civil war. It is rumored that Somoza invited Sandino to dinner at his home in an attempt to negotiate an end to their conflict and get the United States to leave the country. And after dinner, while they're sitting having dessert and cigars or whatever, Somoza pulled out his revolver and shot Sandino and then had him buried in the backyard. We're not sure exactly if that story is totally true, but we do know that Sandino was murdered, and Somoza then was able to completely take over the country. Somoza, since he is an American supporter and he's anti-communist, and in the 1930s, that's very important, he established a government there, and the United States was happy about it, so we will bring U.S. troops home from Nicaragua, and the Somoza family will control Nicaragua until the 1970s, when there is another revolution in Nicaragua that will lead to the Somoza family being overthrown. But for about 40 years, the Somoza family controls the country. In 1912, William Howard Taft was defeated in his re-election efforts, and Woodrow Wilson, the first Democrat in quite a number of years, was elected to the presidency. Woodrow Wilson, even though he is a Democrat and he professes not to believe in imperialism, he is also considered one of our imperialist presidents. When Woodrow Wilson was running for the presidency in 1912, he promised that he would respect other countries and that he would not use American power to control other countries. And so when he becomes president, his foreign policy is sometimes referred to as moral diplomacy or missionary diplomacy, because he said it was the role of the U.S. to do good in the world. However, we see that in many cases, Woodrow Wilson will violate his own moral or missionary diplomacy. However, he does get off to a good start. In 1913, he and his Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, will negotiate what's known as the cooling off treaties. This was an attempt to get people to reject war in the world and promise that they would instead use diplomacy to try to end conflicts. The cooling off treaties were signed by about 30 different countries in 1913, early 1914. And unfortunately, we see that the cooling off treaties don't work very well, because many of the signatories of the cooling off treaties end up getting involved in World War I in 1914. But it was an effort to try to get these countries to agree to diplomacy, though it did not work very well. But we see as you can see on this slide, there were many violations of his own moral diplomacy, sending the troops, the Marines, into the Dominican Republic early in his administration. He will also send troops into Haiti and take over Haiti. American occupation of Haiti will last from 1915 to 1934. In 1917, we purchased the Virgin Islands. This also had to do a little bit with World War I going on and our attempts to secure the Caribbean during World War I. And he will also send troops into Cuba in 1917 under the Platt Amendment. So even though Wilson is very vocal in his opposition to intervention, we also see that he intervened more than any other president, including Teddy Roosevelt, who gets really the bad rap for being the wielder of the big stick. Woodrow Wilson is much more an interventionist than even Teddy Roosevelt. One area that Wilson intervened that will have a long lasting negative impact on the United States is in Mexico. Because of our intervention there, we are going to have a very tense relationship with Mexico for a number of years. Shortly before Wilson became president, there was a revolution in Mexico overthrowing their long-term dictator, there were efforts in Mexico to establish a democratic government. The problem was that Mexico really had never had a truly democratic government. For years and years, there had been dictator after dictator, and Porfirio Diaz, the last dictator, had been there for about 30 years. And so when the new government comes into power, they are trying to establish democratic principles and ideas, but they're moving kind of slowly. They are meeting resistance from the military, and so the government is unstable, and that government is overthrown. Francisco Madero was the president of that government, and he is overthrown and actually killed by military leaders in the Mexican government. And this happens right before Woodrow Wilson becomes president. So when Wilson becomes president, the Mexican general that had overthrown Madero and was responsible in Wilson's mind for Madero's assassination was Victoriano Huerta. And so President Wilson said that the United States would not recognize the Huerta government in Mexico. So we're going to have a period of what we call non-recognition of Mexico. And what he's hoping is that this will force the Mexican people to overthrow Huerta. And there were still groups within Mexico that were opposing this military government that was being established by Huerta. And those democratic forces that opposed the military were led by Victoriano Carranza. And so we have Huerta versus Carranza going on in Mexico. So it's this internal conflict that's going on in Mexico. President Wilson did not want to just sit by on the sidelines. And so he offered to Carranza that the United States would provide them with money and weapons and anything that they needed to overthrow the Huerta government. But Carranza turned him down. He refused. He said that they did not need American help. Basically, Carranza is afraid that if he accepts American help, he will be seen really as an American puppet. And also, America usually doesn't give our aid for no reason. It will give America more of a foothold in Mexico. And so we're waiting and hoping that something will happen that will allow us to become involved in Mexico. And eventually what does happen is an American merchant vessel is in one of the Mexican harbors, and some of the sailors on that merchant vessel get arrested, and they are released almost immediately. They're just held for a few hours and they're released. But Wilson uses that as an excuse to ask Congress to send troops to Mexico to when what he called redress of grievances. Basically, we've been insulted, so we need to send troops down there. It was really just an excuse to try to get involved because we did not feel that Carranza could defeat Huerta without American assistance. And we also had received word through our diplomatic channels that Germany was sending weapons to Huerta, that there was a big gun deal for Germany to sell these weapons to Huerta. So the U.S. Congress will approve Wilson sending troops down to Mexico. In 1916, the U.S. will land troops in Mexico at Veracruz, and this begins the American involvement there. To our surprise, the Mexican people, both Carranza's people and Huerta's people, objected to our involvement there. But our involvement did lead to Huerta having to resign from government, and Carranza will eventually take over the government. But Carranza, too, is upset with the U.S. and our high-handed actions of sending troops in without being invited. Opposing Carranza, once Carranza becomes president, is a very famous Mexican outlaw, Francisco, better known as Pancho Villa. And Pancho Villa begins attacking American businesses and American citizens that are living in Mexico, attacking Carranza's government and government installations. As long as things stayed in Mexico, we agreed to allow Carranza and his people to take care of it because Wilson is trying to patch up those bad feelings between the U.S. and Mexico. But in 1916, Pancho Villa makes a raid into New Mexico, and he attacks an American town in New Mexico, killing 17 Americans. So at this stage, Wilson says, okay, we gave you the opportunity to take care of the problem. You could not do that. So we are going to send troops to Mexico to capture Pancho Villa. So in 1916, General John Pershing is going to be sent to Mexico to capture Pancho Villa. About 10,000 troops are actually sent down there, and we chased Pancho Villa around Mexico for about a year to no avail. We did not capture him. He knows the land. He had been an outlaw before he was in the Mexican military. He becomes this kind of hero to the American people, to the Mexican people, because he's opposing the Americans. And so we chased him around for about a year, basically just stirring up more bad feeling between the U.S. and Mexico. In March of 1917, President Wilson will call Pershing and the American troops home because by this time it's become apparent that the U.S. will be entering World War I, and so we need all of our troops, especially our most experienced troops and generals like General Pershing, to go to Europe to fight in World War I. The legacy of Wilson's intervention into Mexico is one of great mistrust and bitterness, and it really is the reason that Germany reached out to Mexico in 1917, proposing in that Zimmerman telegram that Mexico join the Central Powers during World War I. Mexico did not take them up on that offer, but there is a long-lasting bitterness and mistrust because of America's high-handed actions in Mexico at this time. And this concludes our Chapter 19 PowerPoints. After this, we will be going to Chapter 20, which we will discuss economics and the progressive movement.